Right now, above your head, an iron atom punches straight through a strand of DNA. It's happening inside an astronaut's body. Someone who left Earth's protective magnetic shield behind several weeks ago already. No alarm sounds, not one warning tone from any system on that entire ship. No light flickers on any console inside that quiet cabin. No sensor blinks red. No mission control call comes through to explain any of this happening in real time. Nothing hurts. That single silent puncture is the whole story of this video, in miniature. Cosmic rays literally turn astronauts into slow-burning time bombs, one cell at a time. The damage never shows up during the mission. It builds quietly in DNA, and eyes, and brain, and vessels. Then it detonates. Cancer, cataracts, memory loss, heart disease. Here's what makes all of that genuinely strange to think about. Astronauts pass every physical exam before launch. They pass every single exam after landing, too. Blood work normal. Cell counts and hormone panels come back exactly where they should. Vision sharp. Sharper than most people's back on solid ground, in fact. Reflexes and heart scans clean. So how can a body that checks out perfectly carry damage already living inside? Why would 6 quiet, uneventful months on a station matter 20 years later on? Long after that astronaut is home, gardening, or coaching a kid's soccer team. What kind of bomb waits decades before finally going off? No ticking, no warning light at all. You've been exposed to this too, though at a far smaller dose than any astronaut. Every single flight you've taken pushed you slightly higher into that same radiation field. Airline crews who fly constantly absorb measurably more radiation than people who stay grounded. A single transatlantic flight delivers a small dose most passengers never even notice. Pilots who fly polar routes near the magnetic poles absorb noticeably more each year. Astronauts simply get the extreme version of something your body already tolerates in tiny doses. Once a spacecraft finally leaves the magnetosphere, it enters space soaked in galactic cosmic rays. That shield, generated deep inside Earth's molten core, deflects most incoming particles before they arrive. Astronauts on the ground, or flying in an airplane, sit inside that same protective bubble. Most of that incoming flux is honestly fairly tame material to begin with. Roughly 87% of that flux is simple protons, the lightest charged particle there is. About 12% is helium nuclei, heavier than protons but still survivable in measured doses. But a tiny sliver of that same flux, near 1%, is something else entirely. Heavy nuclei like iron, stripped completely bare of every single orbiting electron, carrying enormous electric charge and staggering kinetic energy, all crammed into one tiny nucleus. Scientists call these HZE ions, short for high-charge particles. Iron-56 is the classic example. Forged inside a dying star, long before our solar system existed. Think of them as the single bullet in 100 that genuinely matters. That single 1% is in practice the entire source of the real danger here. HZE ions tear through a spacecraft's aluminum hull, meeting almost no meaningful resistance at all. They tear through shielding, the exact kind engineers spend years designing specifically to stop this. They barely even slow down doing it, passing through solid metal almost entirely unimpeded. An ordinary X-ray, or even a hospital CT scan, scatters its energy broadly and gently. An HZE ion behaves in the exact opposite way instead. It drops nearly all of its energy into one narrow, brutal line instead. Numbers help clarify this, so take them one at a time. Over a full round-trip Mars mission, roughly 860 days total, astronauts absorb about 1 sievert. That number alone sounds abstract on its own, so compare it to something concrete instead. NASA's entire career dose limit for any astronaut at any age is 600 millisieverts. Read that specific number again slowly. A single Mars mission alone could blow straight past that entire lifetime allowance. Not close to it, and not by a small margin either. Past it entirely, in one trip, before the astronaut even turns around for home. Most people picture space radiation exactly the way films picture nuclear power plant disasters. Sudden sickness. Some collapse right there on camera, in front of the whole crew. A dramatic mid-mission collapse, followed by some tense rescue scene. That picture is almost the exact opposite of the truth. The real danger moves slowly, cell by cell, never announcing itself at all. It causes deep molecular damage with no visible symptoms for years, sometimes for decades. Disease rates only start climbing quietly, long after that specific mission has already concluded. once the astronaut is safely home, telling everyone how fine they feel. So what exactly happens when an iron nucleus tears through a living cell? More than half of that single particle's total energy releases along that one narrow path. In one narrow corridor, barely wider than the DNA molecule it's tearing through, it rips apart both water molecules and fragile DNA strands inside that same tight corridor. Ordinary radiation spreads its damage thin across a great many cells at once. Those cells shrug that kind of scattered damage off routinely, almost without any real effort. An HZE ion concentrates that energy into one devastating, densely packed line of molecules. That concentrated damage isn't some clean, simple break a cell can patch and move past. It typically produces 2 or more separate strand breaks, all crowded tightly close together, plus extra smaller lesions, scattered immediately around that exact same overwhelmed region of the genome. A normal isolated break gets repaired quickly and cleanly by enzymes built for that job. Clustered damage is a completely different category of biological problem for any single cell. Repair machinery moves far slower here, stumbling badly trying to fix several breaks at once. Quite often, that same overwhelmed machinery simply gets the fix entirely wrong. When repair fails on damage this tangled, a cell has exactly 2 fates left. It either dies outright and silently and completely, or it survives instead while carrying a mutation buried quietly deep inside its own code. Here's the twist that matters most in this entire grim biological mechanism. A dead cell can never become a tumor later, under any circumstance whatsoever, full stop. A surviving mutated cell absolutely can, given enough time and enough repeated cell divisions. So it's specifically those wounded, surviving cells that carry the real cancer risk forward for the rest of that astronaut's entire life. NASA has actually run these exact numbers, treating biology almost like insurance-style actuarial math. Their radiation risk model, built patiently from decades of mutation data, calculates something genuinely sobering. Astronauts flying a Mars mission face a 3% risk of dying from radiation cancer. 3%. That's roughly 1 crew member in 30, statistically, dying specifically because of that one mission. NASA's own internal safety standards flatly call that number unacceptable. Not a footnote buried inside some internal report nobody outside the agency ever bothers reading. A real red flag, according to the agency's own written and formal safety rules. That 3% figure has a formal name and a specific paper trail behind it. It comes from a formal NASA framework, one called Risk of Exposure-Induced Death, a model built specifically to quantify exactly this delayed, compounding, and largely invisible danger. In 2021, the National Academies of Sciences finally stepped forward with one major formal update. 600 millisieverts, applied equally to every astronaut regardless of age or sex. That single change replaced an older, considerably more complicated system used for decades before it. One older system had quietly, deliberately set lower limits specifically for women astronauts, based on older cancer susceptibility calculations that newer, far larger datasets no longer fully support. Cancer isn't alone in this, not even close. Turn to the eyes now, where the proof looks nothing like a laboratory experiment. Back in 2001, Kukanada and colleagues combed carefully through NASA's longitudinal study of astronaut health. That archive tracked 295 astronauts across many years, carefully comparing exposure against later outcomes. Astronauts whose eyes had absorbed more than just 8 millisieverts developed cataracts noticeably earlier. 8 millisieverts, a remarkably small threshold, given how lasting the resulting effect turned out to be. That's roughly what a few chest CT scans deliver, added together. This wasn't a cell culture experiment run inside some cramped university basement laboratory. It wasn't a DNA repair lab either. It came straight from ordinary eye clinics, not a single specialized research facility, and it landed squarely on the same underlying mechanism anyway. Cataracts, it turns out, form through the same exact mechanism already driving that cancer risk. Heavy ion tracks pass straight through the lens, that small, clear disc behind the pupil. They damage the delicate proteins and cells that keep that lens clear for decades. Here's the cruel detail that makes this one specific organ so uniquely vulnerable to it. The lens simply can't replace its own damaged cells, the way skin does. It can't renew itself the way blood replenishes, or the way skin quietly heals over. Whatever gets wrecked inside that lens simply stays wrecked, unlike an ordinary wound that heals. accumulating quietly for the rest of that person's remaining years, one cell at a time, different organ, same outcome. In 2016, Michael Delp's team at Florida State University published a genuinely striking result. It appeared in the respected journal Scientific Reports, published under the larger Nature umbrella. They studied Apollo astronauts specifically, a small and very carefully documented group of explorers, the small handful who left the magnetosphere for the moon. Their cardiovascular disease death rate reached a striking 43% among that small group. Compare that number to astronauts who only flew in low orbit, shielded by the magnetosphere. Their heart disease death rate came in noticeably lower, at just 11%. Astronauts who never went to space at all sat at just 9%, roughly average, close to the general population. Leaving the magnetosphere even once, even for a short time, roughly quadrupled that underlying risk. Delp's team didn't stop at simply reporting that one unsettling statistic and moving on. They traced that specific number directly to one culprit inside the vascular system, that endothelium, the thin, delicate inner lining coating every single blood vessel across the entire human body. Damaged endothelium triggers ongoing dysfunction that never fully resolves, even long after the mission ends. That same dysfunction promotes plaque buildup inside the arteries, narrowing them gradually, year after year. It also drives chronic, low-grade inflammation throughout the entire vascular system for many years, and it gradually stiffens blood vessel walls that once flexed easily for years. Later research reinforced this exact same mechanism from several other, completely independent lines of study. Some described radiation-triggered scarring inside the heart muscle itself, stiffening that steady pump over time. Others found measurably elevated stroke and heart attack risk, showing up years after exposure ended. For decades, one particular organ seemed to sit safely outside this entire grim pattern: the brain. Neurons rarely divide, unlike skin cells or blood cells that constantly replace themselves entirely. So radiation biologists confidently assumed neurons were largely protected from all of this. Rapidly dividing cells looked like the obvious targets for almost any kind of radiation damage. That's exactly where DNA copying errors tend to get permanently locked in. For years, cancer and cataracts got nearly all the attention as the only long-term risks. That comfortable belief didn't survive long, not even close. Charles Lamolli and his team at UC Irvine published a study in Science Advances in May of 2015. They exposed lab mice to charged particles carefully engineered to match real cosmic ray conditions. The results were entirely unmistakable and honestly a little unsettling for anyone reading closely. Persistent brain inflammation that simply refused to fade with time, no matter how long. Disrupted signaling between individual neurons, exactly the wiring that memory formation depends on. Measurable impairments on learning and memory tasks, the kind usually tied to much older brains. The brain, it turned out, was never actually resistant to any of this radiation damage. That single study forced the entire field to rethink the brain's role in deep space. Follow-up work only deepened that particular mystery further, instead of resolving it neatly for anyone. Researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, publishing their results in 2025, found something almost backwards. Lighter, faster-moving particles deposit noticeably less energy during each individual pass through tissue. And yet those lighter particles actually cause noticeably more cognitive and behavioral change. More change, in fact, than the heavier ions responsible for the cancer-type damage described earlier. That means there's simply no single shielding strategy that protects against both threats equally well. Thicker hulls help meaningfully against some particles, absorbing a real portion of that incoming flux, but they do nothing at all against others. Engineers now face a genuine trade-off, and no clean, complete solution exists just yet. To be honest, not every study agrees on how severe this cognitive threat is. Some rodent and primate research uses doses closer to what an actual mission would deliver. Generally under roughly 2 sieverts total, comfortably within space-relevant exposure limits, it found no measurable impairment at all across several carefully designed and tested tasks. A few of those same studies even showed slightly better performance on certain high-level tasks. That's a real, unresolved tension sitting right at the center of current space radiation science. The true long-term cognitive risk facing real human astronauts remains genuinely, honestly uncertain. Not every claim in this field has settled evidence behind it yet. That gap matters more than any confident headline, Picture firing a single bullet clean through a tall stack of old photographs. Now picture throwing a fine spray of sand at that same stack instead. Sand scatters small, shallow dings across many photos at once, barely denting a single one. Most of them still survive perfectly readable, easy to make out afterward. That's ordinary radiation, spread thin and largely survivable in most cases. A bullet does something else, something far more concentrated and permanently final. It punches one narrow, devastating tunnel straight through every photo in its path, destroying anything caught directly inside that single, unforgiving line of travel through the stack. Even careful, patient restoration can't always undo what that single narrow tunnel left behind. An astronaut's entire body absorbs a slow, continuous rain of these invisible bullets for months. None of them hurt in the moment. None of them show up on any scan taken that day or that entire year. The tunnels simply sit there, embedded across the eyes and the vessels and the brain, patiently waiting for enough of them to finally add up into something visible, years later. Now the whole picture, every thread at once. One single iron nucleus tears a concentrated narrow track straight through one fragile living cell. That clustered damage overwhelms the cell's normal repair machinery almost immediately, nearly every single time. A cell that survives that botched repair carries its mutation forward for life. That specific mutation drives a cancer risk NASA formally calls unacceptable under its own rules. That exact same mechanism, seen through a completely different medical lens, produces measurably earlier cataracts. Seen through mortality records, it produces a heart disease rate 4 to 5 times higher. Traced directly back to damaged blood vessel linings, spread throughout the entire circulatory system itself. And a mechanism once assumed to spare the brain turns out to reach it too, disrupting memory and clear thought itself, the things that make a person feel like themselves. Even while that particular finding still awaits fuller confirmation from future research down the line. Here, finally, is the quiet and uncomfortable irony underneath humanity's greatest technological triumph. Crossing millions of miles of freezing space, then coming home, ranks among humanity's greatest achievements. But its clearest, most lasting mark isn't left during the daring parts everyone applauds. It isn't left during launch or a spacewalk, not even the splashdown crowds gather to celebrate. It's left silently instead, buried deep inside tissue nobody bothers examining again for decades, until a cataract quietly forms years too early, or a heart attack arrives a full decade earlier than anyone reasonably expected, or memory starts slipping in ways no post-flight physical exam ever predicted or screened for. That same iron nucleus is still there right now, decades after splashdown. Its ionized track has long since scarred over or turned one ordinary cell against itself, sitting inside a body that once orbited the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour, a time bomb that never once announced to anyone when exactly it was set.